All right, folks, buckle up because today we're diving into a really a really complex issue, gun control. We're going way beyond those sound bites and those slogans you hear all the time, and really trying to figure out what actually works, what actually moves the needle. So to help us do that, we're taking a deep dive into some really interesting research, starting with legal scholar Carl T. Bogus and his article, "The Hard, Simple Truth About Gun Control."
Yeah, it's a really thought-provoking piece. I mean, he really challenges a lot of the assumptions that we have about gun control.
Yeah, and one of the things that really struck me was his critique of this whole good guy with a gun idea. It seems like common sense, right? Keep the guns out of the hands of bad guys and
Right.
let the good guys protect themselves and everyone else. But Bogus argues that this whole model is kind of broken.
Yeah, he makes a really compelling case. I mean, how do you reliably determine who's a good guy and who's a bad guy
Mm.
before something happens, before a crime is committed? Bogus points to some really powerful examples like the case of Jamie Gilt, who was a strong gun rights advocate, and she was tragically accidentally shot by her own 4-year-old son.
That's just heartbreaking. And it really kind of highlights, how even people who are responsible gun owners, they can still be touched by these unimaginable tragedies. And it makes you wonder if this whole good guy bad guy approach is maybe just too simplistic.
Yeah, it is. And when you look at, you compare the U.S. to other developed nations,
Mm.
our overall violent crime rates aren't that much different,
Oh, yeah.
but it's the lethal violence that really sets us apart. And that's very directly related to the availability of guns, especially handguns.
So what you're saying is it's not that Americans are inherently more violent. It's that our violence is more likely to be deadly because of guns.
Exactly. And Bogus's research points to the sheer number of handguns in circulation as being the biggest factor in our uniquely high gun violence rates.
Huh. That's a pretty bold statement. But what about concealed carry laws? I mean, a lot of politicians, they argue that concealed carry actually deters crime. They say, more armed citizens means safer streets. Does the research support that?
Well, back in the 90s, there was a lot of attention on John Lott's book, More Guns, Less Crime, which seemed to support that idea initially. But later research by scholars like John Donahue and Ian Ayres
Hmm.
really debunked Lott's findings and showed that concealed carry laws actually don't have that crime-reducing effect that he claims.
So even with millions of Americans now carrying concealed weapons, we're not seeing that promised drop in crime. And in fact, Bogus highlights how concealed carry can sometimes actually escalate situations. Like in that road rage incident back in 2013 in Michigan, where two drivers with concealed carry permits ended up shooting and killing each other.
Yeah, it's a tragic example of how easy access to guns, even for people who are supposedly good guys, can have these really deadly consequences. And it seems counterintuitive, right? You'd think that more guns would actually deter criminals, but the data just doesn't bear that out.
It's a real head scratcher for sure. Okay, so concealed carry might not be the answer,
Yeah.
but what about mass shootings? It feels like they're happening more frequently, and they generate a lot of fear and anxiety. Is there any data to support that feeling?
Yeah, the data on mass shootings is really concerning, and it's important to point out that there's no single universally agreed upon definition of what constitutes a mass shooting. But organizations like the Gun Violence Archive,
Hmm.
they're tracking these events really carefully, and their data suggests that these events are sadly happening at an alarming rate.
Yeah, and often after these horrific events, the conversation turns to mental health. Is that really the root of the problem, or are we missing something here?
Well, mental health is obviously a complex issue, and it certainly plays a role in some cases. But research from experts like Michael Stone and James Allen Fox show that many mass shooters actually don't meet the legal definition
Yeah.
of mental illness.
Yeah.
Focusing solely on mental health as the solution is kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound.
So even if we could perfectly identify and treat every person with mental health challenges, it wouldn't solve the problem of mass shootings.
Right. And even predicting who might become violent is incredibly difficult. Bogus cites the research of John Monahan,
Right.
who developed an algorithm to assess violence risk, using over 100 different factors.
Over 100 factors. Wow, that sounds incredibly complicated, and I'm guessing it's not foolproof.
It's not. And think about the logistics of trying to get that much information on every single potential gun buyer,
Hmm.
it's just not realistic.
And it raises some real ethical questions too about denying people their rights based on predictions, especially when those predictions aren't always accurate. And as Bogus points out, a New York Times investigation actually found that over half the shooters in 130 mass shootings were already legally prohibited from owning guns.
That's a really chilling statistic. It suggests that even with stricter background checks, we're still going to have these gaps in the system.
So if focusing on bad guys and mental health isn't really working, where do we go from here? What's the alternative?
Well, this is where Bogus makes his most impactful point. He argues that the only proven way to drastically reduce gun violence is to reduce the number of handguns in general circulation.
Reduce the number of handguns. In America, that sounds like a monumental task.
Yeah.
I mean, almost impossible.
It's definitely a challenge, but maybe it's time we stop asking, is it possible, and start asking what would it take? Because the evidence really suggests that reducing handguns is the most effective solution. So let's unpack that a little bit. Let's look at why that is.
Okay, I'm listening. Convince me. Why are handguns such a big problem?
All right. Well, let's take a look at the FBI data on murder weapons. What jumps out at you there?
Wow. Handguns are involved in over 60% of murders.
Right. And it's not just about premeditated crimes, right?
Yeah. I mean, I see here that a lot of these murders are happening during arguments, domestic disputes, moments of passion.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It's those situations where easy access to a handgun can turn a heated moment into a fatal one.
So it's not just about keeping guns away from criminals. It's about recognizing the inherent danger of having so many handguns in circulation, period.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you look at the numbers, the cost-benefit analysis is pretty stark. In 2015, there were over 6,400 handgun murders compared to just 215 justifiable handgun homicides.
That's a huge difference, and it really makes you question this argument that more guns equal more safety. But let's be real for a second. How do we even begin to reduce the number of handguns in the U.S.? I mean, isn't that a political non-starter, especially with the Second Amendment?
Well, the Second Amendment is often seen as this insurmountable obstacle to stricter gun control.
Yeah.
But Bogus argues that its history and interpretation are far more nuanced than most people realize. To really understand the Second Amendment, we need to go back to its roots, all the way back to the English Bill of Rights of 1689. It actually had a provision about the right to bear arms, very similar to ours.
Wait, the English had a Second Amendment before us? I never knew that.
Well, not exactly a Second Amendment, but the concept was there. See, the English provision, it came about because of this power struggle between the Parliament and the King. The King was trying to disarm Protestants while arming Catholics.
Oh, so it was about making sure that one branch of government couldn't just take away the people's right to defend themselves.
That's a big part of it. But here's the key difference. The English Bill of Rights specifically stated that the right to bear arms was as allowed by law, meaning it was subject to regulation by Parliament.
So it wasn't some kind of absolute unlimited right to own any weapon you wanted.
Not at all. In fact, Parliament had a long history of regulating firearms. They restricted ownership to the wealthy. They had strict rules about the types of guns people could own and how they could use them. They even made a distinction between handguns and long guns, recognizing that concealable weapons posed a unique danger.
Huh. Sounds like those English folks were pretty practical about gun control. But how does all this connect to the American Second Amendment?
Well, the American founders were deeply influenced by the English Bill of Rights. They saw the Second Amendment as a similar kind of safeguard. But in this case, it was about the balance of power between the federal government and the states.
Okay, so remind me, what was the big concern back then?
One of the biggest sticking points, when they were trying to ratify the Constitution, was the militia. The new Constitution, it gave Congress the power to organize and arm the militia. And that really worried a lot of people.
Especially in the South.
Why the South? Was it just a states' rights thing?
It was more than that. Remember, this was a time when slavery was still a huge part of Southern society. The South relied heavily on state militias to maintain control over the enslaved population.
So they were worried that Congress, with its growing anti-slavery movement, might try to disarm the Southern militias and leave them vulnerable to slave revolts. Exactly. Patrick Henry, the give me liberty or give me death guy, he was strongly opposed to the militia clause. He argued that it could put the South at risk
Yep.
and even accused supporters of the Constitution of potentially wanting to encourage slave uprisings.
Wow, that puts the Second Amendment in a whole new light. It wasn't just about individual rights. It was also about protecting a system that depended on armed force to control enslaved people.
That's a point that's often overlooked. And James Madison, the guy who actually wrote the Second Amendment, he was aware of these concerns. He wanted to make sure that the states kept some authority over their militias, regardless of what Congress did.
So the Second Amendment was really meant to guarantee that states could have these armed militias, partly to protect the institution of slavery. And it specifically mentions a well-regulated militia, which suggests that the right to bear arms, it isn't absolute. It can be regulated.
That's right. And remember, back then, arms meant muskets, not the kind of high-powered weapons we have today. The founders couldn't have even imagined the level of firepower that we have now.
So if the Second Amendment isn't this impenetrable barrier to gun control that some people make it out to be, does that mean stricter gun control is actually possible in the U.S.? Could we reduce the number of handguns without changing the Constitution?
Well, Bogus makes a strong argument that the Supreme Court's understanding of the Second Amendment can change over time. After all, it's happened before, right? The NRA, they spent decades campaigning to shift the focus of the Second Amendment away from militias and towards individual rights.
Yeah.
And they were successful.
So if the NRA can change the narrative, maybe we can too. Maybe we can create a new understanding of the Second Amendment, one that puts public safety first and acknowledges this historical context that we've been talking about.
It's a long-term strategy for sure, but it's not impossible. Bogus points to the example of Common Cause, a nonprofit organization that successfully campaigned for separation of powers in Rhode Island. They faced huge obstacles, but they were able to change the state's constitution through persistent public education and really powerful storytelling.
So we need to shift the conversation about guns in America, right? Move away from this good guy, bad guy mentality and focus on what actually works. Reducing the number of handguns. We need to make this a voting issue, get people fired up about it, and stop accepting the status quo.
It's about creating a new cultural understanding of gun ownership, one that recognizes the true costs of having so many handguns in circulation.
Yeah.
And focuses on responsibility and the well-being of our communities.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean taking away everyone's guns overnight. It's about finding ways to gradually reduce the number of handguns
Right.
through buyback programs,
Yeah.
stricter licensing requirements, and maybe even phasing out certain types of handguns over time.
Those are some pretty bold ideas, but maybe it's time to start thinking boldly. What if we could change the whole way we talk about guns, the stories we tell about them, the value we place on them? What if instead of seeing guns as symbols of freedom, we start seeing them as potential sources of tragedy?
That's the kind of reframing that we need. It's about changing hearts and minds, not just laws. It's about appealing to people's sense of responsibility, their desire for safety, and their love for their families and communities.
It's about saying, look, we can do better than this. We can build a society where we don't have to live in fear of gun violence. It won't be easy. It won't happen overnight, but it's a goal worth fighting for.
And it all starts with acknowledging the hard, simple truth about gun control. Reducing the number of handguns in circulation is the most effective path to a safer America.
You've given me a lot to think about today, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It's clear that this is a complex issue with no easy answers. But what I'm taking away from this deep dive is that change is possible, even on an issue as divisive as gun control.
That's the spirit.
Yeah.
And remember, this isn't just a theoretical discussion, right?
Yeah.
Real lives are at stake. What if we could create a world where tragedies like Jamie Gilt's were the exception, not the norm?
That's a world worth fighting for. And it's a fight we can win if we're willing to challenge our assumptions, have those honest conversations, and work together to find solutions that actually make a difference.
Well said. And that brings us to the heart of the matter. If reducing handguns is the most effective solution, how do we actually make it happen? What can we learn from other countries that have successfully implemented stricter gun control measures?
Okay, let's explore that. Give me some examples. How have other developed nations managed to reduce gun violence without sacrificing individual rights?
Well, let's start with Australia. They faced a horrific mass shooting back in 1996, and their response was swift and decisive. They implemented a nationwide gun buyback program, banned semi-automatic rifles and shotguns, and tightened gun licensing and storage requirements.
Wow. A nationwide gun buyback program? That sounds pretty drastic to actually work.
The results are pretty compelling. Gun deaths in Australia plummeted, and they haven't had a mass shooting since. And it wasn't just about the buyback program. It was a comprehensive approach that addressed multiple aspects of gun control.
So it's not just about taking away guns. It's about making it harder to get them in the first place and ensuring that they're stored safely.
Exactly. And Australia isn't alone. Countries like the UK, Canada, and Japan have all implemented stricter gun control measures and have seen significant reductions in gun violence.
But those countries are different from the U.S., right? They have different cultures, different histories. Can we really compare apples to oranges like that?
That's a fair point. But Bogus highlights some research that compares cities with similar demographics and crime rates, except for their gun laws. Take Los Angeles and Sydney, for example.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the story there?
Well, these cities, they have comparable populations and overall crime rates. But when it comes to homicide, the difference is staggering. Sydney's homicide rate was only 4.8% of LA's.
Wow, 4.8%. That's a massive difference. What explains that?
The key factor is handgun availability. City has far stricter gun laws than LA, making it much harder to obtain a handgun.
So even in cities with similar crime rates, the one with fewer handguns has significantly fewer homicides.
Exactly. And there's another study, the Seattle-Vancouver study, which looked at two cities with almost identical crime rates, but different gun laws. The city with more handguns have far more murders.
It's starting to feel like a broken record. Fewer handguns, fewer murders. But how do these other countries actually get people to give up their guns? I mean, wouldn't that be met with massive resistance?
It wasn't easy,
Yeah.
but they focused on public education and framing gun control as a public health issue. They appealed to people's sense of responsibility
Yeah.
and emphasized the need to protect their communities.
So it was more about changing hearts and minds than forcing people to comply.
Exactly. And they also implemented buyback programs, offered incentives for turning in guns, and made it clear that the goal wasn't to punish responsible gun owners, but to create a safer society for everyone.
It sounds like they took a long-term approach, focusing on gradually shifting cultural attitudes and implementing practical solutions over time.
That's the key. Real change takes time and persistence. It's not about finding a quick fix, but about committing to a vision of a safer future
Yeah.
and working toward it step by step.
This is all really fascinating, but I have to admit I'm still skeptical. America is so different from these other countries. Our gun culture is so deeply ingrained. Do we really have a chance of achieving similar results?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's where we need to shift our focus from what seems impossible to what's actually within our control.
It feels like we're up against a pretty powerful force here. The gun lobby in America is no joke.
Yeah, you're right. The gun lobby has been incredibly effective at shaping the narrative around guns. They've framed any attempt at regulation as an attack on freedom, on individual rights.
And it's not just the lobbying, right? It's the lack of funding for gun violence research, the loopholes in our laws, the general feeling that nothing can be done.
It's like we've just accepted gun violence as an unavoidable part of American life.
But what if we haven't really tried everything? What if we could learn from those other countries, adapt their strategies to the American context?
That's where Bogus's research offers some hope, I think. He points out that the NRA was incredibly successful in shifting the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
They spent decades on this carefully orchestrated campaign, and it worked.
So if they can change the narrative, maybe we can too. Maybe we can shift the focus from individual rights to public safety, from fear to responsibility.
It's about changing hearts and minds.
Yeah.
And that starts with education. We need to talk about the real costs of gun violence, the human tragedies behind the statistics, and the proven effectiveness of reducing handgun availability.
It's like you said earlier, reframing the issue as a public health crisis, not just a matter of individual rights.
Exactly. Imagine if we treated gun violence with the same urgency and resources as we treat other public health emergencies. We might have a very different understanding of the problem and more effective solutions.
So where do we start? How do we actually make this happen?
Well, it starts with each of us. It starts with challenging those deeply ingrained beliefs, having those uncomfortable conversations, and demanding action from our elected officials.
Yeah.
It's about looking beyond the rhetoric and focusing on evidence-based solutions.
What about those other countries we discussed? What specific lessons can we learn from them?
Well, Australia's response to the 1996 Port Arthur massacre is a powerful example. They implemented a nationwide gun buyback program, banned semi-automatic weapons, and tightened gun licensing and storage requirements.
That sounds pretty ambitious. Did it actually work?
Well, their gun death rate plummeted, and they haven't had a mass shooting since. Now we need to be realistic. Australia is a different country with a different history.
Yeah.
But their success shows that change is possible, even in the face of tragedy.
What about those other countries like the UK or Canada? Did they take similar approaches?
They did. They focused on reducing handgun availability through stricter licensing, background checks,
Hmm.
safe storage laws.
Hmm.
They also invested in public education campaigns to promote responsible gun ownership and shift cultural attitudes.
So it's not just about taking away guns. It's about creating a system that prioritizes safety and responsibility.
Exactly. And remember, those studies comparing cities with similar crime rates but different gun laws. The cities with fewer handguns consistently had fewer homicides.
It's that same message again. Reducing handguns saves lives.
And it's not just about the numbers.
Yeah.
It's about creating a society where people feel safe.
Yeah.
Where parents don't have to worry about their kids being victims of gun violence. Where
Yeah.
we can have disagreements without resorting to lethal force.
It's about building a culture of peace, not a culture of fear. But honestly, it feels daunting. How do we even begin to shift the tide in a country where guns are so deeply ingrained in the culture?
It starts with each of us.
Yeah.
It starts with having honest conversations with our friends and families, educating ourselves about the facts, and supporting organizations that are working to reduce gun violence.
It's about voting for candidates who support common sense gun control measures and holding our elected officials accountable for their actions.
It's about sharing stories like
Mhm.
Jamie Gilt's that humanize the issue and challenge those ingrained beliefs.
Mhm. It's about believing that change is possible, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Because if other countries can do it, why can't we?
It won't be easy and it won't happen overnight.
Mhm.
But if we're willing to put in the effort to have those tough conversations, to challenge the status quo, we can create a safer, more peaceful future for ourselves and for generations to come.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to the complexity of this issue, but it's also given me a sense of hope that change is possible. It's not about taking away anyone's freedom. It's about protecting our communities, our families, and ourselves. It's about choosing life over fear.
And it starts with each of us taking responsibility, getting informed, and taking action.
So to our listener out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some food for thought, some new perspectives, and maybe even a little bit of hope. Remember you have a voice and you can make a difference.
Get involved, stay informed, and never give up the fight for a safer America.
Until next time, keep diving deep.